we are weirdly obsessed with the stuff that, like, the mechanisms of production, like of the stories of how we get there. And in some ways, I think it's a shying away from the responsibility of making good music at all costs.
That's Harper James, a Brooklyn-based producer, mixing engineer, and songwriter whose mix of indie and label work has amassed over 50 million streams and been featured on various viral charts and blogs. If you're familiar with Harper's TikTok, then you know that he is a master of blending the technical with the emotional and intellectual, often leaving you pondering the why behind whatever it is that you're doing. So today we're going to get into how our own sonic preferences may or may not be in our control.
Do the work to figure out what you actually prefer, because most people don't know their own preferences and aren't aware that their own preferences are like hardwired rules within their nervous system.
Why he calls A/B testing a marketing psy-op.
I think that A/B tests are like useless. And I think they're mostly used to reinforce our own biases.
And the mistake that too many artists make in today's world of stream counts and social likes.
Or you can be like, you're gonna die, dude. And you're gonna have something to show for it. And it's either gonna be a bunch of anxiety around DSP streaming or some masterpiece that you made that changed your life. Like, you can pick.
This one definitely got me thinking. I think it'll get your brain going as well. So stick around for an interview with Harper James. I've had this conversation idea, and I kind of mentioned it to you for a while.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a fun place to start. And it's kind of based around like the idea of familiarity, right? People are drawn to things that feel familiar. Like, we have a lot of nostalgia for things that we, grew up with. Like, I love a good Juno synth. Is that because I'm a child of the 80s? I don't know, maybe. Or like analog tape. Everybody loves analog tape. Is it because we've heard 70 years of recorded music on analog tape? So I guess all that being said, what do you think about the influence of nostalgia or familiarity on music creation? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it a tool?
I think about versions of this all the time because I think it's really relevant to producing, especially, like, almost more than mixing, although very relevant there too, because you're really just talking about, I think it's the question of, is there some element of music or sound or any of our senses that are just wired into some kind of like evolutionary level where certain things just tap into our dopamine receptors better than other things? And I think, like, you have to start from a place of, like, yes, on some level, there are certain sounds that are painful, right? Like, where we've evolved for them to cause pain and fear. And so those versus a sound that might be musical to some people or less musical to other people, like, there has to be a red line where you acknowledge that to some degree there's an objectivity to certain things, right?
Yeah.
Then once you get past like that red line of, like, a chainsaw cutting through steel like an inch from your ear is not a good, pleasant sound, then you get into this sort of question of, like, can you separate art from the context, from your experience with other music, from the cultural context that you are from? And I think when we're younger, we live in this kind of like ideal world, this bubble where, like, when I was like 10, I thought Green Day's Dookie was the best album. And I don't mean it was my favorite. I thought it was the best album. Like, I thought that I liked it because it was the best album. And that anyone who didn't think it was the best album was wrong. They just didn't know it yet. Like, I had a certainty that my taste existed in this vacuum, basically, and that I was reacting to objective qualities.
Right.
And in that way, right, like, if you're thinking about, because I understand your question, you're basically saying, like, do we like the sound of like a, Ampex or an ATR tape machine because that is the thing that we've heard on all our favorite records? Or do we like it because, I guess, there is some intrinsic quality to it that appeals to us as human beings on a visceral level that's basically wired into our evolution?
Yeah.
Because that would have to be the only other option, right? Like, if you're going to make a claim to something not being appealing to us because of the context in which we interact with it and our history with it and how we've, like, developed our brains to be wired into that stuff, then you're appealing to some kind of like deep evolutionary truth. And I think to some degree it's a combination, but I think as you get older, you realize a lot of things that you thought were objective we're completely culturally conditioned. Like the reason I liked Green Day's Dookie was really more because I was like a suburban kid, you know, in the early 2000s or whatever, than because that record was the best record ever made. So I understand the answer to that question as being within the realm of reason when you're not talking about like very grating, viscerally unpleasant sounds, which could still be construed as art,
Yeah.
but in an abstract way, right? But when you're talking about pleasure, which is I think what you have to talk about, because art is totally anything can be art, right? That is 100% context.
Yeah.
When you're talking about pleasure, what gives us pleasure? That's oftentimes what I'm thinking about, like what's like a hedonic feeling of pleasure. And I agree with you. I like tubes. I like tape. I like old microphones. I like Gibson small bodied guitars. I like all of the things that have appeared on all of my favorite things. And in fact, when I'm trying to figure out if I want to buy a piece of gear or if I want to approach something in a certain way, one of the things I'll do is I'll ask myself, how did my favorite records get made? What were they doing on those, whether they're modern or vintage or whatever? And for me, more than an A/B test, if I have an intuition that, I kind of like, L2, L1, Parlor Martin, these small bodied guitars, I like them. Let me go and see how many great records use those kind of guitars. And it's like, oh, like all of them. So that's a good indication that I'm on the right track, right? But the question then becomes, do I like those guitars because they were using all my favorite records, or were they using all my favorite records because those guitars are objectively good, right?
We're getting into like chicken and egg territory here.
Yeah, I mean it is, but I think like as with the chicken and the egg, right? Of course, the egg came first because the chicken not born from an egg isn't a chicken, right? I mean that's a funny one to me. There's like if someone gave me a piece of chicken and we're like, here's a chicken sandwich. The only thing is this chicken was not born from an egg. It had like a mammal birth. I would first say, well, it's not a fucking chicken. I don't care how many feathers it had, and I'd also say I'm not eating it, But like that aside, it is this kind of circular thing. But I think it's more useful to understand this stuff as nostalgic, as conditioned, because the truth is we can't really know what the things are that are tapping into like some kind of evolutionary, deep, fundamental human truth and what's not. And claims of objectivity are very often like harmful to growth, development, subtlety, maturity, right? Because like if you're just saying, oh man, like I mean, this is the classic thing, like maybe tube mics are better than non-tube mics, but if you just make the claim that that's just the truth that because your opinion is just tapped into some objective absolute truth, you may be right, but you can't prove that you're right, and it's generally like harmful for thought and debate. Like when you make those claims of okay, I've identified something, right? You can say I love Tom Petty. And someone could say, well, you just love Tom Petty because, you grew up in this era and this part of the world and these were the things. And I could say, no, I just like Tom Petty because he's better than the band that you like, objectively. That's not a very like useful, even if you believe that, that's not like a very useful way to communicate. So I think when we're talking about preferences, it's more useful to talk about them in terms of context and in terms of like saying, I probably like tape machines and SSLs and these because that is what I learned to like. Now, I also do believe there's probably some qualities like subtle variation that have to do with our brains like this sort of subtle combination of being able to anticipate something and also being surprised.
Yeah.
And so, like, for example, a tape machine, one of the things you can't really emulate is the total randomness of like the pitch warble, right? Or the flutter. So you can do like a sketch cassette, but there's always some kind of algorithmic pattern to it, no matter how fancy they get and how random they get. And our brains are so sophisticated that there's no way you can deceive your unconscious mind. You might be able to trick your conscious mind, which is why people get fooled in ABs all the time, because like your conscious mind can't tell the difference. But when you unplug from that critical and analytical facet and you just listen as a listener, you're tapping into some kind of deep sort of like sensory nervous system, unconscious truth about what you respond to. And that is very hard to fool. So like, I do think there's probably something about certain tools that add that are able to out like smart even your most sophisticated pattern detectors and that we like, that's
Yeah.
pleasurable, right? And when we can detect a pattern and no variation, we immediately like tune out, we get bored. So I think if you're going to make an argument to some kind of truth claim about like quality, it has to be on the grounds of like sophistication and nuance. So like how much subtle variety, subtle change, subtle, you know, is there that flies beneath the radar of even our most sophisticated pattern detecting systems,
Yeah.
right? So like there could be, but again, to bring it back to like the context, like it's sort of a nature versus nurture in terms of our nurturing to prefer certain things. I guess here's where I finally land with this because I have thought about this before. I guess clearly, I believe it's subjective. I believe it's personal, but I think the thing is we cannot get around our preferences. So when I say it's subjective, there's no, tape machines aren't necessarily better than not tape machines, tubes, like all these things that are kind of like romanticized as awesome in audio. I could say you can't make an objective truth claim that they're better. We just culturally, statistically prefer them, or at least some group of engineers prefer them. But that is an objective truth. So a lot of people, I think, who understand that there's this intrinsic subjectivity to taste and that we're conditioned, they think that that frees them from their own conditioning, that they are able to choose then what they like. That I don't believe.
Yeah.
So I think that whether or not, you say, I like tape machines, right? That's not a choice. That's something that you've noticed about yourself. And so the degree that you can make an argument that everyone in our current civilization may in fact prefer tape machines. And there's just some people who are lying to themselves and some people who have done the digging to notice the difference and consciously become aware of their own preferences. And I think that this is like what Rick Rubin is after when he's talking about it doesn't matter what you think someone else is like, it only matters what you like. I don't think he's saying choose what you like and impose that. He's saying do the work to figure out what you actually prefer because most people don't know their own preferences and aren't aware that their own preferences are like hardwired rules within their nervous system.
Yeah.
So like you can be wrong about your own taste, right?
Oh yeah.
You can be wrong, right, about what you think. You can think you like stuff for reasons that have nothing to do with your experience of the thing, their stories. And so when we say, okay, SSLs are popular, needs are popular, not because they're inherently better, but because, we heard a lot of our favorite records on them. That doesn't mean that it's a story we tell ourselves that we can then choose to abandon because it's objective. What it means is that there's a fundamental, deep truth, an absolute truth about our subjective preferences there. And that may, in fact, be almost universal because of the larger context, right? Now, everyone has their own personal stories and context and preferences and conditioning. But even within the wider world, there may be certain conditioned preferences that are almost universal. And so whether those are almost universal preferences are some absolute deep thing that could not ever be overcome through some kind of shift in civilization and technology over the next 1,000 years is almost irrelevant. So it's like, do you see what I'm trying to say?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where I land. So for all intents and purposes, there are absolute truths about our own subjective preferences, but they're not quite the same as some kind of like absolute truth claim about bottom line human beings prefer X. It's like bottom line, I prefer X. And actually, probably bottom line, you prefer X too. You just may not know it because you may not have done that truly subjective self questioning to get to the bottom of your own preferences. Like, so for example, if you can't afford to buy a tape machine, you may prefer a story that says, well, that's subjective. This is just as good as that. It just depends on what your taste is. But like, that might just be lying to yourself to tell yourself a more convenient story. You may, in fact, have no way around the fact that you actually do like the sound of tape machines more. Like we're all stuck. So we might as well do the research on our own taste as if it was an absolute truth.
Yeah. There's so many things that you touched on in there that I want to bounce back to. Like when you said art versus pleasure, that makes so because art, like you said, like no boundaries. It's like whatever you're feeling.
Right.
Pleasure is like what are the things that you know excite you, that that appeal to you, that you're drawn to, which are inherently going to end up in your art, obviously.
Yeah.
But then the idea of not recognizing your own preferences, I think, is really interesting because, like you said, Dookie was your favorite album because of like your surroundings. So there's like this amount of nurture.
It's probably because it was literally the first album I ever got played that wasn't my parents' album. So it was my favorite album.
Yeah, your surroundings really especially when you're coming up like in a studio, right? Like you're like a runner, it's your first day in the studio, you see that so and so's got ATCs and they use an 1176 on vocals and a Neve, and like you don't even care what's going on around you. That is going to be like you're going to want ATCs for the next 10 years of your life, and you're always going to go Neve 1176 because yeah, your surroundings to a certain point totally dictate your preferences until you kind of
Yeah.
reach that I guess like I don't want to say like, you know, Zen place,
Yeah.
but yeah, until you realize that you have been fooled to not recognize what you prefer is kind of an interesting thought. I like that.
Right. The story you tell yourself is I'm a good engineer. They're a good engineer. They use an 1176 and a U87. So that means I like it too.
Yeah.
But you may not actually know what it sounds like. Like the people who really like Neve consoles the most probably have never heard the word Neve. They like Phoebe Bridgers. They like Jack Antonoff's new work. They like Lana Del Rey's last two albums. They like, they like the Foo Fighters. They just know what a Neve sounds like, but they don't know what a Neve is, right?
Yeah.
Like they like Third Eye Blind self-titled album. They like, they just like all these records that were done on Neves, right? Probably to tape. And so they may actually like there's a whole generation of people out there who just fucking love the sound of Neve to tape who don't know what tape is or what a Neve is, right? But they have the advantage of not being tied up in all these narratives because they're not an engineer. So they don't have the language to talk to tell stories about it. They're just reacting to like their haptic, you know, senses. Like they're reacting to the visceral nervous system response to it, which is how we should be reacting as engineers too. But we tell ourselves all these stories. Like we say, oh, I really like the sound of tubes. You may not. One of the things I've learned about tubes is that they have a thing. It's like an upper mid range thing that can be warm or it can be cold or it can be hard or it can be soft. It just sort of depends, but they're not always good. That's just a
Yeah. Yeah.
story. That has nothing to do with my taste, right? So, you bought a really expensive piece of gear. You're just gonna want to tell a story in which that was good, that you like it. You may not like it.
We're kind of talking about like how people need to figure out what their preferences are.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe you've sat down and done this. How do you think someone can figure out what their sonic preferences or musical preferences are?
So I think that A/B tests are like useless, and I think they're mostly used to reinforce our own biases. So like most A/B tests are about proving to other people that your inferior product is just as good using psychological warfare, or you're using it to prove to yourself a story that you want affirmed. They're very rarely used in a scientific way because we're almost incapable of being scientific about things, which is why there is the scientific method and peer review, which forces you to do that. So outside of a peer review situation, like A/B testing is pretty useless, I think, and mostly like a sales psyop.
That's interesting.
Like, so how many A/B tests have you watched that weren't a company trying to prove to you that their shittier product was just as good as the real thing, or B, a person trying to prove to themselves that the choice that they've already made was a good choice in the face of some instinctual doubts about the choice.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there's a few things wrong with like the A/B test that I see going around. One is that a lot of it has to do with cumulative, not one instance. So you might not be able to tell the difference between like a 1073 and a Focusrite Pre on one low gain DI guitar. That may be something that feels pretty close. But if you stack 15 backing vocals at medium gain on both of those, you will hear a difference. Another problem with A/B testing is people's monitoring is really bad. So like one of the things that like plugins get away with a lot is compressors, is that the from like 100 hertz to like 5K they do really well. And then below 100 hertz and above 5K they do terribly. But most people who have a pair of Rockets or Yamahas, like they actually can't hear those frequencies. So it doesn't matter that the pumping on 60 hertz, 50 hertz on the 1176 clone is like just terrible and is going to wreck the whole headroom balance of your mix if you can't hear it. They just have to convince you, knowing that you're listening on AirPods or your computer speaker or whatever, that that little chunk of audio that you can hear is pretty much the same. So unless your monitoring is actually full spectrum and you're doing cumulative instances of stuff, and you're aware that, for example, a lot of like analog plug-in emulations require different input levels to get the same response as the hardware, they're not calibrated correctly, and you're compensating for that in a scientific way, you have no idea what the AB is telling you, right? And even if you could full frequency monitoring, read the manual of both the analog and the hardware, give it the right input level calibration, the same output level calibration, it may in fact be that one of the things actually just performs better with more input. Like there may be different sweet spots.
That's true.
You just can't win, right, that way. So the way that I do it, right, is I basically just have an instinct about something. And I look and I see who else has had that instinct and how many times has that approach, that tool, whatever, been used in situations that resulted in art that I like. And if it's a lot, then I might buy the gear or try out that method of recording or do whatever it is. And if I have a lot of, if the process feels right to me and it gets me a better result than before, then it works. And it doesn't particularly matter like why it works,
Mm.
right? If it gets you to a better place, then it works. And it's a little bit like this argument about like placebo. It's like, yeah, the placebo saves people's lives. The placebo effect cures people of cancer, right? Like it's real. This was this big thing in the scientific community where they used to write off they're like, well, it's placebo. It's like, but wait, this guy just like, is in remission from an uncurable form of cancer to placebo. So it's not like you don't dismiss the placebo,
Yeah.
right? You say, who fucking cares if it's placebo or if it's chemicals? It's all chemicals. You right. It's like you just use the thing that gets you a better fucking result if you care at all about the actual work.
Right.
If you're just trying to convince yourself of some story that you're attached to, then do the AB and convince yourself or don't convince yourself. But like, if you want to get a result, then you have to just do it and see if you get the result that you want. And my thing that I've come to embrace is if you're serious, then almost anything is worth it. Meaning like if I really am chasing something in art that's like a hard thing to chase, like a sound or whatever, it's like it's a game of like millimeters, right? So like I
Yeah.
may spend a year trying to get 0.2% more dialed in on something, and it's worth it because what else am I going to do with my life? You know what I
It's,
mean?
it's true. It's true.
I think it's like, what is it? You know it when you see it. I think that that's the only truth. It's like if you aren't like, I'm sure about certain things, and even if I'm wrong, it doesn't matter, right? Like I'm sure that I really like the sound of my Phoenix mastering compressor, you
Right.
know, like I'm sure. And you could prove to me in like a court of law or in a lab that it's just placebo, and I could use a mainly varying mu from UAD and it would do the same thing. And I would just say that you're wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I am sure that I'm getting better results using it. I don't know why. I don't know if it's because, so I think, and I don't really care why. And I think that this is the thing that's different between like, I think my generation of producers, mixing engineers, and like the a generation before. Like not that there was like a proud ignorance exactly among, the big time A-list guys, but like there sort of is.
Can you elaborate on proud ignorance?
Like someone like Chris Algy or Michael Brower or, I don't know, Manny Miraquin or these guys, like I'm not so sure that they feel the need to prove to anyone why their results are good, including themselves.
Okay.
And I think that we feel this need to prove to ourselves that what we're doing is right. There's a kind of lack of like, like half the content on the internet is basically dudes proving to each other that like they bought the right speakers. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do.
And I'm not sure why we need to do that. It's like just listen to the work. If it's good, then clearly it's working. And I think a lot of it is because, people, there's a culture of like learning and education. And so I understand the impulse to analyze and dissect stuff and ask the questions of, is there better ways to do stuff, or is it all just conditioned and subjective? Because if we could prove that there was like an objectively best, preamp or an objectively best way to record, then that would be great. And it would like solve all of our problems immediately. And we would just do the best way. And so it's like, it's the holy grail,
Yeah.
right? It's like the quest for like certainty in a world of uncertainty. And, people tend to either embrace this sort of like incredibly like geeky and obsessive, and compulsive, not obsessive compulsive, but like obsessive and compulsive way of trying to double check everything and scientifically make all of their choices defensible. And then this other thing of being like, it's all subjective. It doesn't matter. You can make a hit with anything. And it's like, that's also pretty stupid. Like hypothetically, yes, you can make a hit with anything, but that doesn't really feel like anything you should live by. That just seems like a sort of a casual random observation about the universe, but it's
Right.
not really directly related to like being a good producer, right?
Yeah.
And so, or being a good mixing engineer, like knowing that you could make a hit with anything, that it's all subjective, it's just about art, like that is a useless sort of cliche. Someone says a thought terminating cliche, right? It's like, because once you say that, there's no other conversation to be had.
It's kind of true.
It's weaponized postmodernism, basically. It's Jordan Peterson being asked, like, do you believe that the Bible is literally true? And then saying, well, what is the Bible and what is truth? And it's just like, shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, here's a thought. You're talking about the old school, and they don't need that validation that like younger engineers or producers on the internet are always like looking for like, look at this trick, and then they just want to make sure they get enough likes to make sure that that trick's actually good.
Right.
I mean, do you think it's more that these guys that have been around forever and are crushing it, they just have the confidence to know that they're at that point? Meanwhile, the up and comers they're looking for peer approval. I mean, at some point, Chris Algy had to want somebody to tell him the mix sounded good.
Yeah, he wanted someone to tell him the mix sounded good. He didn't want someone to tell him that his technique of parallel compression was good.
Mm,
It's different because I think that what's happened is that culturally I think that if you were like a mixing engineer, let's just mixing engineer because it's technical, so it's like an easier analogy
yeah,
to make. Production is so like mixing engineer, right? You have these like A-list guys who mix the hits, right? So it's an easy category to kind of talk about. Like my take is I'm a fan of Michael Brower and I've known him over the years in various contexts. And like, so I've got an inside view on his thing more than some other people. But I think that one of the things that always appealed to me about him was that he was obsessed with how it sounded. It's a little bit like Andrew Shepp says this thing too. Like it only matters what's coming out of the speakers. Like don't write your client an email and being like, well, I did this here and then I did this here. And I'm not sure if I could, he's like, don't do that. It's like, if it's good, it's good. If it's not good, it's not good. Like they'll tell you. You don't need to like, but I think he was talking to a younger generation of kids and that, I think he was doing some kind of college, seminar or whatever. And he was basically saying like, the goal here is music,
yeah,
right? And anything along the way is just happenstance.
yeah,
And whatever you need to do to get to that result is valid. And I think that there's a very strong sense now that we have, I'm sure there's like a critical theory way to like explain this, but it's like we have turned our attention to the mechanisms by which the thing happens for some reason, meaning we're really interested, it seems, as a culture in the stories,
Mm,
right? Of how someone gets somewhere rather than like the artifact of the art,
yeah.
which might be okay. Like it's like, we're interested in who the artist is dating as much as if their song is good. We're interested in what compressor the engineer used as much as does the vocal sound good. Like we are weirdly obsessed with the stuff, the mechanisms of production, like of the stories of how we get there. And in some ways, I think it's a shying away from the responsibility of making good music at all costs. It's
Yeah.
like if I
Yeah.
can just get validation for my process, then it doesn't matter if I pull through for the artist or for the song. If I actually make it right. And ironically, if you start choosing your method based on the method and not based on the results, you get worse results definitionally,
Yeah.
right? Like if I'm like, I record vocals with this mic because it's a better mic, not because it sounds better through the vocals, then like you're going to make the wrong choice in almost every situation.
Yeah, I love this. This is what I'm thinking, and this, hopefully this doesn't offend too many people. And if it does, you should probably rethink, what you're doing. I feel like maybe we're interested in the story and the technicals because the majority of people are afraid to walk their own path. So they want to walk a path that has been laid out already, which is just setting yourself up to crash and burn. You're going to be super frustrated when you don't have
Yeah.
Harper's career. You have to like make your own
Well,
career.
you'll be fine without my career. Yeah, but yes.
Well,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It's like, it's,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's why people get obsessed with the story and why they're obsessed with the techniques because
Yeah. You're trying to figure it out.
they know that those things work for somebody else. They want them to work for themselves.
Look, it's interesting. Like I mean, I think I like enjoy talking about this stuff because like these are all of like the micro traumas that like we all go through and that, I worse than anyone, I think in the beginning was captivated by uh people's process. Like
Mm,
as if it was a key to my own thing. Like, and I think one of the biggest examples of this, speaking of Brower, is like his Browerized thing. Like I personally think he's like one of the greats of all time, and that like he exists in a category of his own because what he was doing was the sort of thing of basically found out how to reproduce people's albums with only mixing,
yeah.
like in a way where the before and after of a Brower mix for me in the instances where I was able to hear like that that stuff, it was like he changed the soul of the song in the mix, and I think now ironically, mixers who do that, people get pissed off at them
Yeah.
because the ego of the producer gets fucked with.
Yeah.
And people just want a little bit of like basically from their mixing engineers, a lot of time they just want like basically stem mastering. I mean, for me too, like
Yeah.
unless you're really dialoguing with the artist and you're involved in the production, like you can get in trouble for improving something too much.
Improving.
Yeah, I mean, but like even actually improving, you can get in trouble if it's too far. So that being said, that being said, there was something really dangerous about how his process of Browerizing registered trademark was exported. I mean, and he was, to be fair, he said this, like, don't do what I'm doing. Like, this is just to show you this how I came up with solutions to my problems. But a lot of people, including me, were like, yeah, but I'm going to do it too, because then I'm going to sound like Michael Brower. And I, in the box, had all this stuff set up, and I was in it, and it really basically just ruined like 3 years of my own mixes, because I was like, I want to do this process more than I want it to sound good.
Yes.
And so like you have to kill your idols. Like they have to just die in your mind as people to emulate. And I think the sooner that can happen, the more quickly you're just going to get to the work of it, which is listening and making gut choices about what the next step is. And I think I think honestly, I'm ashamed to admit, like only very recently really embraced the sort of one foot in front of the other process to mixing in terms of just what's here, what is my assessment of what needs to be changed, and only do that. Don't just put on your stuff because it's your stuff and blah, blah, blah. Just listen, stop yourself, and identify the thing that you need to do next, and then do that. And then fucking hands off, and then identify, like, and when I started doing that, it was like things started going okay. Like
Yeah.
things sounded good and things would work because you're actually responding to a moment. You're not telling all these stories. And like I think that it's like that's when you asked about, our associations. Like, do we like stuff because, that's the context in which we were conditioned? And it's like, yes, but I think we almost have to just forget about the fact that it's subjective, that our taste has been conditioned and subjective, and just accept it for what it is, as if it's an objective, absolute foundational truth, and operate from there because that's our compass. That's like what makes us unique. That's why someone would hire you.
Yeah.
It's like you work with artists because I do mostly producing and mixing, and then occasionally I'll mix records for people that I have not touched on the production end. So like mostly as a like producing, there's like sort of two kinds of people. There's people who know what they like, and there's people who want to know what you like or want to guess what someone else likes and do that. Maybe it's their manager, maybe it's their friend, maybe it's their mom, maybe it's me, whatever.
Yeah.
And those people are very hard to work with because you go around in circles. Because they're like, well, what do what do you think? And I'm like, I'm the producer, so I can weigh in. But as soon as you start trying to guess what someone else likes, then obviously, then because there is no objective thing, you're just chasing these stories, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, then just stop, listen to what's there, and tell me what your gut says to you in whatever terms you want. It could sound too much like a '90s rom com. That's fine, but I want to know what your reaction to the moment is, not what you think is objectively good, right? Because that's a concept.
Yeah.
I don't want to know what you think your tastes are. I want to know what your reaction is in the moment because that's your actual taste. People do this all the time. They like dark records. Everyone likes dark records. Nobody actually likes dark records. People like 87s. Nobody actually likes it. I like 80. This is the thing. I like dark records and 87s, but I'm very aware when someone says I like really dark stuff that they're just lying to me. So I ignore them because nobody likes dark stuff in 2023. What people think dark is like hilarious. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
so much artificial. It's like I like dark stuff. It's like, but I do want you to put a Pultec on it and crank 16 dB, like maybe 10 to 20 dBs. And I want you to do it I want to record on a Rode NT1 and I want to take the waves. It's like nobody likes dark stuff. It's like, and this is, I think, where you get into the technical stuff and taste joining up with this technical stuff. What I think people mean is they like when the upper mid-range resonances have been well controlled so that it can be cranked and really bright and not harsh.
Yeah.
What they don't like is a bunch of like spiky transients that are flying under the radar and making your ears bleed. But they also don't love it when you take care of that stuff and leave it naturalistically dark. That's all. They don't like that, in my experience.
Yeah.
Mastering engineers don't like it. A&Rs don't like it. Managers don't like it. Artists don't like it. Mixers don't like it. Nobody likes it that way. So anyway, I digress. But yeah, it's like an interesting rabbit hole or whatever. But taste is objective subjectively, and we should just learn to be our own detectives rather than our own storytellers. It's like people saying, I'm trying to find my sound as an artist, and they're like, I want my sound to be this. And it's like, well, that's just like a gimmick.
Yeah.
Finding your sound is about being, in every choice you make, incredibly self-honest about what your visceral reaction is to that moment.
Totally.
And then building on that one step after another step after another step until there's no more steps to take. And then you get to discover what you actually like. And you may not like what you like. You may not like that you like what you like. But it doesn't fucking matter. Nobody cares. That's what you like. You made all of those choices. You know what I mean? You made 1,000 choices in a row that all led you to here. So that's what you like. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I have a question because it's funny how like you're like wandering through my notes even though I'm not asking the questions.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's great. Talking about artists like trying to find their sound, right? And like you said, choose what resonates with you, choose the next thing. Like you have to go on that journey, and that journey's fucking hard, right? How does a young, easily influenced artist that doesn't know their sound get past the world of likes, views, and streams to find what they really want? Because even if you do what you want and you've got that less than 1,000 and like 2 likes on your Instagram reel, like your instinct is to run from that thing, even though that's the art you wanted to make. I don't know. Do you have advice for people that are going to stray from their path?
I think that as humans, we exist on two levels, right? It's like we have our day-to-day life in our current culture, which is just so superficial and driven by dopamine and fear, petty fear,
Yeah.
shitty, stupid fear.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this person's gonna, and driven by, just our normal, shallow sense of what matters on a day-to-day level, like myself included, right? And then it's like, I had a really bad, I don't know, food poisoning or stomach bug. And I have rarely felt worse. It's like one of those states where you're like, I can deal with this, but if you told me that I would be this way forever, I would actually rather die. You know, I don't know if you've ever been really sick, like nauseous and sick, and I'm not talking about like sick. I'm just talking about a little stomach bug, right? You can be put into a different place where your values change really fucking fast,
Oh yeah.
right? Like it doesn't take very much to drop you out of that. Like, man, my biggest concern is Spotify going to playlist my song? To holy shit, life can be really dark. And I should be pretty grateful that I wake up most days not feeling like this. Like,
Yeah.
so just to, so I think what has to happen on some level with young artists, because I do work with a lot of young artists, like getting them from their first song to like maybe their first streaming to maybe manager, like trying to get them to that next place. And so you go on these journeys with these young people. And one of the most rewarding things is, I mean, I don't know what to describe. It's like seeing people get real. Like seeing people start off in this thing where they're like, okay, like I want to do this EP, but like, should we really be thinking about like, maybe some playlist stuff first? And, all of the bullshit is just
Yeah.
crowding in their mind.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, it's sort of like, I don't know, have you written a song that you really believe in? Like, not even getting real, just getting like a little bit real. Cause like music is just fun, right? Like, so it's not
Yeah.
even, the stakes aren't even that high, even when they're super high, right? So it's like, I think what needs to happen is something that I try and do is be like a grown up in their life who's like, that stuff doesn't matter. You have to let it go because you won't be happy with yourself if this is how you spend your 20s worrying about this stuff. Like, let's just like, and I think hearing that from like an older person who's like a producer can be helpful,
Oh
right? So
yeah.
that's like
Yeah.
nice. But I think, usually what has to happen and what I think had to happen with me to sort of shake off some of the bullshit was like getting so burnt on that stuff and just deciding it's not worth worrying about. Like it's not worth it. Like,
Yeah.
your life, you get older and you're like, how many years do I have left? Is this how I want to be worried, spending my time like worried about this shit? And I don't know if this is like exactly what you're asking, but like I think some of the best artists are people who at a very early age are just like, oh my God, none of this fucking stuff matters at all. The music is just a game. It doesn't matter. And they may take it very seriously on some level, but they're able to stay like someone like Billie Eilish always struck me as like a savant at understanding what matters. Like there's an interview with her when she's like, 15 and they're like, how do you deal with like fame and all the pressure? And she's like, well, I just think about, how in 100 years, not only will I be dead, but like no one will even know my name or remember me. I'll just be completely gone. And that makes me feel way more chill. And I was like, that's like the most epic thing. I mean, for someone that age to say it and believe it, you could see her thinking about this, and it actually made her happy that she would be dead and completely forgotten. And
Yeah.
I think, like, she's a bit of like a goth kid. Like, she likes to be edgy or whatever, but I believed her because I'm like, well, that is actually how you would put this into perspective. That's one of the only ways
Yeah.
you could, right? And so I think, like, I mean, what is like, I think there has to be like a, coming of age where you like realize that it's like where you realize like what matters. And I think as an artist, what matters is making stuff that is good. And some people get there and some people have success but never get there. Some people get there and don't have success, and some people get there and have success in terms of like they find their in to making art. And like for me, I think as I get older, it's like I realize that like I just want to make I'd rather make like art with someone who is like less developed as a musician than make really digestible content with someone who's very experienced and talented.
Mm,
Like,
yeah.
you have to work in a way that's lined up with your values, and you have to know what your values are. And I think so until as a young person, you develop a sense of values, like actually in life, not about music or whatever, and then a way to live those values through your art, you will find yourself sucked into the distractions and the stress and the superficiality
Oh yeah.
of the creative process and of the industry, and whatever pulls your attention is going to own it until you have an anchor that connects you to like what you know to be true. And it's like when you talk about taste is one of those things that can anchor you, just knowing what you like. It's like an introductory version it exists on the level of art making, not on the level of like being a person, but it still is important. And then it's like, what do you think is important? And I think it's the only thing that can free you from the anxiety of creativity is connecting it to a deeper value.
Hmm.
And it's why, I mean, this is why people who are like, super religious have this weird advantage sometimes, because even if their fundamentalist like evangelicalism is like fucked up, it is something that transcends any mundane activity. So they have an underlying belief system that can guide their choices, even if the belief system is totally messed up. And so as like a normie atheist Jew, whatever, semi-Buddhist, whatever, it's like we have to basically create a believable value system for each person that is strong enough to basically anchor us to some path.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to achieve some external thing to tell you're on the right track, because there's only like one right track and you have to figure out what it is. But that's the work, not you're not waiting to know. And I think goes back to what we said about like it's like this impulse to be like, should I A B this? It's like, well, if you like it or not, you don't need to A B it. The only reason to A B something is if you don't trust your own take, or if you don't have your own take.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're totally having like an external belief or like an anchored value that removes the the necessity for like the world to approve of what you're doing.
Yes, thank you.
Whether you're talking about a higher being or you're talking about your own self and like decided value, that's what your beacon is. And then you can do whatever you want.
Sorry if you're a hardcore evangelical. No offense.
I am not. I am not.
If you were, that would be fine. Whatever.
But I wanted to say, like, if you're listening to this and you're an artist and you ever like if you ever have an opportunity, you have a song that just like pops off and you just get all these deals put on the table. If you don't know who you are, don't sign that deal, because I've seen this happen. The worst thing you can do is walk into the major label machine without knowing truly who you are, because they will turn you into something else and you will hate it. I don't know if you've encountered that, where like somebody just doesn't know what they want. They get an opportunity and they turn into this other thing that maybe works, but in the end, it wasn't them.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, I mean, the people I know who have been in sort of like mediocre to crappy to like decent that ended badly deals, like were usually confused until it was over. Like just this sort of state of like, why did they spend $40,000 on like a live music video that my friend would have done for 1,000? Wait, we got on today's top hits, but we didn't make any money. What's going on? And then like they get dropped, and then like they have to spend the next 3 years like putting the pieces together of like what even happened, or I think there's a lot of people who aren't really into music and get the deal, and then that is a truth, and they have to, because a lot of the like signees are young people, like they're good at social media or whatever, but they're not like music people. And
Right.
then they're like, okay, now you the rest of your life is just music, but maybe they don't know how to play the piano or do anything, and it's like it's a weird thing. But I don't know, I mean, I'm not, as someone who like is like peripherally attached to the LA Imperial Core. I have my take, but I think that's a good example because it's so concrete, but it's also just like it has to be worth it, even if, all the worst case scenarios play out.
Yeah.
And I mean like worst case scenarios, like, you get hit by a fucking bus or whatever. Like if you're like, if you're doing something as a means to an end, it's not it's not worth it. Like because you don't know, you first of all, you don't know what you want. You don't know
Yep.
what's good for you. None of us do. And second of all, you can't control what happens. So it's like you have to be involved in the process for its own sake. And the process has to be about communicating something real,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the end is the communication of it to yourself, the expression of it to yourself, to your own satisfaction. And then the releasing of it is releasing it. That's actually what it is. You are letting it go. It isn't, you're over, it's done.
Yeah.
And like, the way that everything has been, because everyone just wants to think, talk about streaming, but like the way that everything has been oriented now is that like the releasing of it is like the beginning of it. It's like that's when you gotta like pimp yourself or whatever. That's when it's like that's not really what it should be. Like it should be that like you put it out and you are done with it. And then it belongs to everybody else. And they can put it in the trash or play it a million times or whatever, and you have no control over that. I mean, there's marketing and stuff, but I just mean you can't control unless you're interested in like mass brainwashing, which may be in fact what labels are in. Then you can't control if people in their heart of hearts actually connect with what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, you said something in there that I wanted to highlight. You said when you're done with something and then it belongs to everybody else. And I think that's like I've worked with a lot of people that, I'd mix a song, and I'm sure you've had this happen too, and then it just never comes out because they're not willing to let go. But just that idea
Yeah.
that it doesn't belong to you anymore, I feel like that can be freeing to an artist because I don't know, I find doing the podcast that putting this thing out in the world is freeing, and it trickles into other aspects of my life. The fact
Yeah.
that I've learned to let go of something and maybe get over the fact that I didn't sound as smart in one episode as I wanted to. It's helped me with my mixing or just like whatever, because you understand that you're the only person that's going to get caught up in that bullshit. Like you're going to put it out in the world, people are going to like
Yeah.
it or they're not going to like it, and it's going to have nothing to do with the insecurities that you had about that thing. It's just going
Yeah.
to be their reaction to your art product, whatever it is.
Yeah. Everything good is on a clock. So like
Mm.
technology's allowed us to like spend a year mixing something, right? But like that is a sort of fable. You can't actually mix something for a year. Like I think you have about like 5 hours, and then
I'd agree with that.
you're toast.
Yeah.
And like, you can do more if there's lots of revisions, but at that point you're just, I oftentimes when something is done to my satisfaction, it's like this is my vision. My instinct is that the artist's feedback is almost always going to make it better, but that at that point I just do what they say. Like I trust that it is because, oftentimes people will say, well, do you think we should bump the lead vocal up a dB. And sometimes I'll listen and I'll say, I was tired last night and I was a little fatigued. Yeah, I probably could give a little more energy and that wouldn't kill us. But a lot of the times I'm like, well, I think what I sent you, do you think it should be up? And it's not in a, like, I'm like, my opinion is literally the thing that I did everything on. Like,
Yeah.
everything here is like an exact non-metaphorical take on what it should be.
Yeah.
And my genuine take, though, is that that's why it's a collaboration. I don't think a mix is done until there's some artist feedback, because it's like, I think like a mix, that almost all art, unless you're, sometimes I have a side project that's just me. I do everything, including mastering, and that's its own weird thing. But like when there are people involved in making something, it is a collaboration, whether or not everyone like acknowledges that.
Yeah.
But I think like I'm getting tangent, but like basically when I think the two things about mixing that like really helped me get to a place where I could really be a professional mixer for people was not being attached to the process and just reacting to what was there, not having a formula that I always had to use this and this and this, just being like, I have all my go-tos, but they exist in my mind, not in like a formula, right? And so I could just freely respond to what's there. And if it meant not doing anything, it meant not doing anything. Or if it meant just doing a big move to make the bass bigger and then mastering it or whatever, like you do whatever. It doesn't have to always go through this process. And the other thing was realizing that I'm on a clock. Like you open the session and you're on a clock. And Tom Elmhurst said this at some point years ago in some whatever. And I remember just being like, that's an interesting thing. And it's a performance. It's your take. It's like anything. It's like you go on a date with someone. You don't get to like do the date as many times as possible and fix everything. Like it's just like, if you could, that would be creepy. If you could go and like edit the person's memory, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's like there's almost something insidious about sitting with a mix and being like, well, I wish I had done this and change it. Like, you get this kind of like weird, it's a fear-based thing where you're fixing anything you think someone might have a problem with versus your honest appraisal in the moment and reaction to something.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a question actually.
Yeah.
How long would you say it takes you to get to like 90% on a mix?
I I think the honest answer is like it really depends. I mean, it can take an hour and it can take 5.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is if something takes more than 6 hours, it's because I'm basically reproducing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm not admitting to myself that that's what I'm doing.
I agree with that.
Right? Like you can totally take 4 days on a mix if you're just reproducing the entire thing from the ground up without being able to record more stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Like I had this funny experience like last year. It was just some random project and I got it and it was an artist self-production and it was just sort of like one of those things where it was kind of a vibe, but I was like unclear of what was going on. It was like there was the bass, but it was like higher than the guitar in the octave, because someone was like probably doing it on their like
Yeah.
near field and they couldn't hear the so it was definitely a thing. And I was getting to this thing where like I wasn't really sure what to do with it. So I remember sort of just doing my best and just kind of like, I was like, I'm not going to just grind up produce this because that's not my job, but I just said compress this. And I was kind of like, I don't know. But I remember noticing on like, it was like verse 2, like the bass notes were wrong. Like they were in the wrong key. It was just not, it was someone just kind of playing low stuff. So I remember I replayed the bass, but it was a block mix. Like I did the same processing to the vocal all the way through. There wasn't like section by section mixing. It was just, so I sent him the song and he goes, yeah, I don't know. It's okay. He's like, but whatever you did on verse 2, I mean, you nailed it. The mix on verse 2 is fire. And he was like, whatever you did to verse 2, can you just do to the whole song and it'll be like great. And it was just like, yeah, I was like, I replayed the bass because the notes were wrong, and I think we sometimes like trick ourselves in terms of like what mixing really is. And so we can trick ourselves into thinking like mixing is where it all comes together. And it's like, I think it's always fun for me to get a song, a rough that's terrible. and then open up the stems and like load them in and be like, holy shit, this actually sounds really good. And then mix that and then send the person the mix and then just be like, what the fuck did you do? How did you blah, blah, blah? And it's like, well, I just did like a normal mix, but I just didn't do all the crazy stuff that whoever did the rough did. Right. And so it sounds like I reproduced it from the ground up because like you may have never heard that the drums actually were tracked pretty well. And, but whoever mixed it, they used the under snare mic as the entire kit and ran it through 80 things because they saw someone do that somewhere, and the bass has like a everything below 100 hertz just like hard cut out of it because someone heard that that's how you save headroom or whatever, like, and so then you just get the stems and it loads up and it sounds like a song and everything's normal and you just like do the mix or whatever. So I'm not saying it's not fun to just like totally spank a mix and have the person be like, holy shit, but it rarely is because you're going like, I'm going to use 5,000 plugins and everything. It's just because you're like being sane and rational, and there was like some moment of absolute Jekyll and Hyde insanity that occurred somewhere between the production and the mix and the rough, and you just are not engaging in that. So it's like you've come in and you're presenting them with this thing. But I think that the idea that honestly guys like CLA Michael Brower sort of like promoted, which is like, this is where the shit happens. Because, who doesn't want to be perceived in that way? Like, who doesn't want their role to be the defining role in the vibe and flavor and taste
Yeah.
of stuff? I have this sort of dubious, like, you know, privilege of doing all three aspects of the process: engineering, producing, mixing in a lot of cases. And so I'm able to basically say, where am I getting the most bang for my buck? Right. And I think in the beginning it was like, smack out the arrangement, have a great song, and then like crush the mix. That's where it's gonna like be fire or whatever. That's when your sonics really come together. And as I got more experience, it was like, well, it's really like the production when you're doing your sound design, like the deep work of like cleaning things up and adding all the right bottom and doing the saturation and stylistically, and that's where it happens, and now I'm like, fuck, it's the engineering. It's like that's all.
Yeah.
That's the style, it's the vibe, it's the expensiveness of it, it's the engineering and it's the arrangement. It's all of the old grumpy engineers were right. It's like, if you can mic it so you don't need to use an EQ, it will be better. And not just better
That's
in a
true.
pure sense, it's going to be cooler, more interesting. There's going to be more depth. You're going to be able to get more level with less compression. Like, it's all going to be better. And mixing engineers maybe not don't love hearing this. And there are things you can do as a mixing engineer that are really, I think, like Brower, where you're rolling up your sleeves and you're basically just secretly reproducing it and then mixing it. Another thing mixing engineers like don't love to remember is like the Beatles albums like weren't mixed in any meaningful way that we would ever use that word today. So clearly I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically by the time they're done with it, they've got drums, bass, tambourine, backing vocal, one mandolin, a cello, and whatever on track one.
Yeah.
And then on track two, it's like lead vocal, another tambourine, electric guitar, and then on the third, the third. So it's like, what are you going to fucking mix that? No, you're just going to go like, oh, the vocals need to be a little louder. But those records are some of the best sounding records ever made. And the engineering is where all of it happened. There was no Pro Tools session to like sound design. It was just, they just did it right. And again, it's like such a cliche and it's so stupid, but like I think for me, like that has also helped me think about mixing, because when I think about mixing like a tracking engineer, right, like all of a sudden you're not thinking about mixing as like, what can Pro Q3 do for me today, right? Like, I'm thinking like, please, Lord, like, let me use as few instances of Pro Q3 as possible so that my mix doesn't sound like an advertisement for Pro Q3's dynamic bands. Because I think like that's what a lot
amazing.
of mixes sound like, is someone really, really fucking knew how to use the dynamic band on Fat Filter's Pro Q3. But which is one important skill, but like, is so much deeper than that. And this is where the conversation about artists getting real right? Because you can talk about how do you help an artist find their sound and really stay focused on task. It's like you can talk conceptually about like putting one foot in front of the other and really thinking about your experience and reacting and not getting carried away by these stories. Or you can be like, you're going to die, dude, and you're going to have something to show for it. And it's either going to be a bunch of anxiety around DSP streaming or some masterpiece that you made that changed your life. Like you can pick, and I think the come to Jesus like moments can happen at each level of the process. Like you
Yeah.
can have that as a mixing engineer or a mastering engineer being like, look, you're a mastering engineer. Are you just going to spend your whole fucking life obsessing about the newest like mid-side multi-band limiting? Or are you going to sit there and be like, I want to make classic albums that like last forever.
Yeah.
And there's no one can save me from myself. I have to just sit here with my tools and just find a way to do it. And you have to make that. It's like, ironically, it's like the stakes have to be so low, right? Like if you think that you're going to live and die on like whether or not you make a great record, you're never going to make a great. It's like people sitting down to write the great American novel.
Yeah.
Sentence one of the great American novel is there's nowhere to go from there, right? So you need to lower the stakes. If it's just fucking music, who cares? And then you can be like, and yet I want to write the great American novel. Who fucking cares if I do? It doesn't matter. I just want to be alive tomorrow and, whatever. But I want to. I'm going to set that for myself. And it's like this weird thing, right?
Yeah.
You want to make great work, but it doesn't matter if you do. Like nobody cares. It's not going to impact your life that much. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, this is my battle, I guess. This is where I'm spending my time and energy thinking about all this stuff, and I think that like I am developmentally on track for my age and experience. I wish I was one of those savants who, when I was 18, had this crystal clarity about the meaning of life and the meaning of art and my values and this deep sincerity of purpose, right? I admit I did not.
Few people do.
Do you know what I mean? I wanted to be in a cool band. Then I wanted to be a hot mixer. And then I wanted, I just chased bullshit, like everybody else my whole fucking life. And I think the battle is to stop and not.
Yeah.
And then what do you replace the bullshit with, I think. And then that when you do that, it's like, I feel like I've done to the degree that I've been able to do that is the only moments when I make these kind of like revolutions in my own sense of my ability of feeling like I'm doing something more real or something that has some kind of significance to somebody, some creative significance. And it's like, otherwise you're running around in circles. It is like you're trying, oh, is this EQ or that EQ? It's like
the sooner you can like realize something, the better it's going to be at the end. Like there's this, like you said, like just because you can change everything in the computer, people feel like, oh, I got to change everything. I don't have to make any decisions. All the best tracking engineers and producers I know, they find what fits that song. They record the drums that way. They do what they have to do. It sounds mixed while they're cutting it, and it's only going to get better from there. And the crazy thing that I think will really blow a kid's mind is stuff gets redone. Like if you're not good enough to play the drums again, and that's why you're afraid to commit to a sound, like the number of times I've heard of somebody like losing a week to their record because they wanted to redo the drums on the first 3 songs because they have this new approach. You can't be tied to these things.
It's like when you realize that you can and I do have some hacks for mixing that I cheat with basically, and one of them is recutting bass guitar.
Yeah,
because I do all the bass on my productions, and like I would say like 80% of the time the bass sucks if it's a played bass.
Yeah,
and I would say, this is like, I think in the last year I've discovered like you can make a mix 75% better with balance, usually. And then you can make that 50% better by recutting the low end. And then you have about 5% to do with EQs and demasking and multi-band compression. And then I would say probably 20% increase from that with managing headroom and your master bus.
Yeah.
Like, I think what you're mixing into as the final thing and where you're starting, those things basically are the walls that close in on you. It's like, and that's where I do feel like, for me figuring out that like final output chain, which is a little bit complicated for me, but very stable, has been very important. And that's one of those like nerdy mixer things that I want to say doesn't matter, but like I have found that it really does. Like I like a sort of, level of saturation, slow kind of tube thing, and then some kind of like limiting at the end that's like probably something in ozone or something that's like pretty modern just to help me with that. And keeping it simple, but those steps, with a few alts there, like having that stable has been really an important development so that I can
Mm,
just do mix after mix after mix after mix and it's like second nature. I just know that. And I think I was the one thing where I was sort of trying to just free float would be like reinventing that final output every time. And it would basically be like relearning how to mix every time.
I agree. Yeah.
And I think like that's one of the things where like, yeah, maybe in some platonic world, every mix would have a completely different gain staging strategy. But I think that's where you just realize like I do certain genres better than other genres. Like I have certain stylistic preferences and EQ curves that I hear and a type of pumping that I like. And it's just like that might be my limitation, but it's in a good way where it forces me to develop a sound.
Yeah.
There was this like yoga dude who said this thing. Forgive the vagary, but it was like a great thing. And I could give details, but it wouldn't matter. But basically, it was like, okay, yoga is about being relaxed, right? But obviously, it's not about being spaghetti. You're not just like, it's about being as relaxed as you possibly can be while still doing what you need to do. And I think this is where I think about like minimalism. I think if I were to like talk about probably what I'm trying to do now is like be a minimalist, but that doesn't mean using not a lot of plugins or using not a lot of elements. It means using the fewest amount of plugins, the fewest amount of elements in the arrangement that I need to get the result I want.
Mm,
So I may need 16 plugins on a vocal, but I try to make sure that I actually need them all. And that's the thing. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with like being what might seem maximalist, but minimalism isn't like prescriptive. It's like or descriptive. It's prescriptive. It's not describing the outcome. It's talking about it's sort of like an ideology, which is saying that if you can use less to get what you want, that's generally going to be better. And like I think you could get into why, but it's almost more just like a it's almost just like more like faith.
yeah.
Like I take it on faith that if I can do something as good with one plugin as I can with two, there's probably some reason why I should just do the one. If the second one makes it better, that's good. Then I'll sometimes ask myself, well, do I need to, or can I do this with the one? Like, is there another band on this EQ that I don't need to add another one on top, or is there a reason why I'm stacking these? Like, so you can use as many as you want as long as it's the least amount that you need to get it done. And I think that's where the importance of engineering comes through. It's like so you have a mic and you have a kick drum, right? And you want more attack. Well, you could do the kick drum mic and then an EQ at 800 or whatever, or you could move the microphone in. I just take it on faith that that's better, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't know why it's better. I take it on faith it is. Now, if it's different, if adding the EQ and having the thing here gives you a different, better result, do that. You don't have to, you know what I mean? But if my intuition says that this actually almost always gives you a better result that you're gonna like more. And the final like piece to that, I think that I'm like learning is that there is a reason I believe why engineering is really important, and it's because it's the only time when you have a chance of getting a unique sound. So
Mm,
like anytime I use like a 1073 style UAD EQ or any kind of thing, like I'm at a point now where like I could probably like sort of intuitively like be like, yeah, this feels like someone's using, if not a 1073, like more of like channel strip style EQs and less like parametric. It has more of a tonal shape to it that feels like there's bumps at 200 and a bump at 3K and a cut at 220. Like you can just tell that things are clunkier done, but which is an aesthetic. It's a vibe. It's cool, right? But it's always going to sound like that. Like if you put on like a EQ shape onto different sources, I think there's some part of our brain that, even though obviously like the end result is the combination of like the source and EQ, that our brain can separate out where the source ends and the EQ begins. That's when we say it sounds processed. It's like we can. It seems like we shouldn't be able to, right? But we can. Like
Yeah.
there's something about your brain that's like, because EQ is a sound. So like it's like it doesn't matter what the EQ is, but like 1073 is a sound, but EQ is a sound too. Something can sound EQ'd.
Mm-hmm.
And so every sound that is EQ'd has that in common. And the more EQ'd the sounds are, the more they sound the same. And this is true like within a mix too. So if you want, okay, so like one of the reasons I would say like why really well engineered records sound so dimensional is because the texture of like a snare through a mic is so much more, the imprint is so unique, right? Like the curve of it is so distinctive and not connected to like a shape, like a dip at 500 and a boost at 3K. Then you start to hear these broad sort of like generic sounding shapes in the mix, and you put a smiley face on your drum bus, and all of a sudden all of the drums sort of start to sound the same, which might be what you want, but I think a lot of the really great like hi-fi records, they don't do that. Like there's not like, if you listen to like a really great, like, I don't know, this artist like Bedouin, or like I forget the producer's name, but these like Silver Lake hi-fi guys, or even like the Phoebe Bridgers records that everybody likes. Like part of the sound of that, I'm beginning to believe, is this thing of like each sound is like left intact in a way that gives it this texture that is so specific that it just grabs your attention. And then this element has another texture. They're not all being put through the same kind of EQ. So it's like some of this like curve, and then that same curve is here, and then another version of that curve is here, and everything just kind of sounds like this mushy thing. And a lot of commercial music sounds just like EQ. Like the main characteristic is like EQ and like, Saturn or something. Like I'm just like, this record sounds like an ad for Fab Filter, basically. Like it's just, I hear that so much that it's like, so anyway, so the engineering, if you're into like style, I think as a producer, and this is where like I think I'm more of a producer, because like I'm like more interested in like style than impact almost.
Yeah.
Like like interesting textures and like unique things that like suck you into them versus things that are well put together. And so, yeah, it's like the more early in this chain that you focus creatively, the more those like imprints are going to just like be themselves and just like grab you.
Yeah.
Like, and it's for that reason I'll hear like a snare, my SM57 on a snare is like a beautiful thing, right? And people say that, but I think I didn't realize what it meant until at some point, I would be like, oh my God, this is like the coolest sounding fucking thing I've ever heard. I'm very unlikely now to be like, but I want this to be bright, so I'm going to crank 8K on it and then gate out the hi-hat. Then you just get this like sort of pleasing impact sound that's just like, do you know what I mean? It's like you don't even hear what it is.
Yeah.
And it's like that's when you listen to like the Andrew Starlow stuff on the Big Thief stuff that everybody likes versus like Nickelback. That's sort of like what I'm talking about versus like engineered and then mixed.
Yeah.
Like CLA, engineer. It's like they're different things. And like one of them is basically this purely based on pleasure.
Yep.
Right? Like CLA mixes are very pleasurable. Big Thief records can be painful, actually, but artistically, they're like really compelling. So I think it's like, it's like I picked that side of things, I think, recently.
Yeah. Well, that brings it all the way back around. And something I like to tell artists is like, the worst thing that could happen to you is that your music plays and nobody has a feeling.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
I would rather somebody hear a song and say, fuck, I hate this.
Yeah.
Or, oh my God, I need to hear this again. But for them to not react either way, you've just created like wallpaper, and you're talking and these
100%.
sonic characteristics you're talking about choices that evoke emotion, whether that be positive for some people or negative for some people. But I think that's more
Yeah.
impactful for somebody than to get 10 million streams and have nobody save your song on Spotify. I'd rather have somebody,
Yeah.
you know, click do not ever play. You know how you can like mute a song permanently. I'd rather have that happen to
100%.
my song than somebody just listen to it and not even see.
I'm pretty sure that's like a main strategy of major labels these days.
Yeah. Is it really?
Just make shit that's
Oh,
so vilely
oh
terrible
yeah. It's
that you can't help but know what it is. Yeah. No,
totally.
no. I mean, no, but kind of some of the like hyper pop stuff, it's just like aggressively bad. And that's sort of the aesthetic, you know?
Oh, I listen to hyperpop. I don't get it. I would never tell somebody that I could mix it. And I sit there and listen to it, and I'm like, this is horrible in like a really glorious way. Like I listen to it, I'm like, this is cool. I don't want to hear it again,
I
but
approve of it. I just like don't, you
I don't
know,
get it. I don't get it.
but it's like what you're talking about. It's like someone has found like these new textures that are, I guess, just like perennial digital clipping or whatever. And that's cool.
Yeah. This has been fun. I keep going. I got a baby I need to tend to shortly. But I got two questions that I hit everybody with at the end. The first one being, which I think we've kind of touched on a little bit, but has there ever been a time in your career where you chose to redefine what success meant to you?
Yes. No, I mean, I think like a few years ago, I realized that there's a culture in sort of like mainstream industry where producers are the artist, where it's like the artist becomes like a vessel for a producer. It's sort of in a Max Martin
Mm,
thing where it's
mm,
like the producer are writing the songs, they're picking the artist, they're telling the artist how to sing it. They are sending the artist away while they design the thing and then sending the MP3 to the artist. Like that there's this kind of like culture of yeah, like it's like producer superstars where it's like the producers are kind of the famous people, and they're like the artist on some level. You think about like even like a Jack Antonoff is in the middle, and I think he's great at sort of facilitating like a Lana Del Rey or Taylor Swift and being their best selves or whatever, and that's great. But there's definitely a culture of like, and I think it's like the producer writer culture and whatever. And I think I realized like I was sort of doing more like writing sessions and trying to like get involved and think about like what my sound is. And I think I like had this realization of like, oh no, 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 no. Like I want to find artists that I really love and believe in and then make the record
mm.
for their perspective. And so like rather than thinking about my career as being like climbing a ladder to get to a place where I could get in the right room to work with a big artist,
Yeah,
it was like finding an artist that I'm like, this person has something to say, and I'm the one who can help them do that.
that's awesome.
And it was really like, that's what I always thought it was. And I think, when you join an industry or you start your career in earnest, sometimes you can have a period where like your initial core motivators are like called into question, and it's like that's not how the world is, and like this is really what you do now, and you're chasing this and that, and you sort of twist yourself to fit some kind of trajectory or path, and hopefully that burns you out quick enough so that you have time to basically catch yourself and say, why do I feel so lost? And realize, oh, because I'm not actually doing the thing that I wanted to do. Like I'd rather be a lawyer,
Yeah,
like, and that'd be fun being a lawyer, so like for me, I realized like I'm not in music to be successful. I would only want success insofar as it's a reflection of doing something I love doing.
yeah.
One of the worst things I've seen happen to people is they get really successful at doing something they hate,
Hmm.
which happens all the time, and then they get trapped into it. Like
Yeah.
it's like, oh well, it turns out I'm like a really good, uh, you know, set drummer, and I got asked to go on tour with, whatever, and then they're a touring drummer with this band, and it's exciting, and they're like, I fucking hate being on tour.
It's true.
Uh-oh.
Common story.
So it's like one of the rules is right. You get to do more of the thing that you succeed at. So don't succeed at something you don't want to do. So I think like, yeah. So I think for me, it was reordering myself into more of a traditional like record person role rather than this like newer kind of like producer as the artist thing, which feels like I want to
Yeah.
find great artists and work with them. I want to be inspired by like the writing of the artist. I don't want to be being like, oh, well, when I had a girlfriend break up with me, this is how it made me feel. I know how it made. I'm not interested in. I have my own side project if I want to express those feelings. Like I want to hear what other people's stories are and other people's point of views. And I think there's a lot of young people who like maybe don't have the, you know, wherewithal to like really do a record that feels right, but they have something very cool and interesting to say. And
Yeah.
like if I can be the person, right, to be like that wasn't there for me, right, when I was like in band and stuff, but you know, where you feel sort of disillusioned of like no one gets me, no one's gonna help me, everyone's kind of trying to get the credit or whatever. Like to be like, we're gonna do this and you're gonna have something that represents this. Like I think making something great with someone I believe in would be my thing that I would like to do one day.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's not enough of that. There's not enough of people, and it goes back to the peer, approval thing. There's not enough people that are willing to help other people's vision come alive without smearing their vision on top of it. It's like this level of pride that people are unwilling to get rid of.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing is, like, I don't believe in a producer as like a transparent cipher for an artist. Like, I think that it's a collaboration, and I don't even see myself as being hired to do a service. I think of it as we collaborate, and I'm in advance. The artist buys out the master because they don't want me to own it. Because if they don't buy it out in advance, then maybe I want it.
Yeah.
And so, we say, all right, you want to work with me, and in advance, I get paid because like you want to guarantee that you're going to own this thing. And if we wait till the end, then maybe I don't want to sell it to you. Maybe I want to own it. And then, so that's what I understand the economics of it to be. Not that I'm like serving somebody's need. They're collaborating with me. So like,
Yeah.
but my goal in the collaboration is that the song gets to say what it needs to say, and that the artist gets to say what they need to say through the song. But yeah, so I think it's like it's a tricky thing to navigate is how you see yourself and what your role is. But like I've come to that. So it's like I'm not a service industry person, which is a lot of times how it gets told to you is like
Mhm.
what this you're in the service industry. I'm like, I don't know. I don't wanna if I were making a record, I wouldn't want to hire a waiter to do it. Like, do you know what I mean? Like
It's true. Yeah.
I don't if I'm hiring a producer to make a record, it's because I don't know how to, and I want to work with that person. I don't just want an automaton. But on the other hand, I think that like I also don't want to like I wouldn't want to hire a producer who's just in it so that they can express whatever they're feeling about their, current love life or whatever through me as a vehicle. That feels weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially if they're a younger person and like I don't know. So I think it's navigating what the expected dynamic in the pop world is or whatever versus like what this other thing is that is less well defined and
Yeah. That's awesome. Last question before we go is what is your current biggest goal and what's the next smallest step you're going to take to go towards it?
yeah, well I think the goal is like I think I'm always on the hunt for something I can sink my teeth into,
Yeah.
like, and so what I do is that I've got generally like every few months I will try and set aside some time to usually with my work, people call me and they hire me and we talk. And if it makes sense, I do it. But I think it's also important to like set aside time and reach out to people that you like, not because they're, successful and you want a piece of it. Oftentimes it's someone who I feel like they're unknown. And I'm like, I think that you're really talented and you don't have the opportunity or the reserves or whatever to make the thing that would really serve you. So I would like to do that. So I want to set aside like 4 days and invite you into the studio and like do a few songs and see how it feels on me, basically. And so
Yeah.
I think like I've started to do more almost like mini A&Ring or whatever of like being like have development projects in addition to the work that comes in and can be tricky. It's like it's a business and whatever. And then the splits get different that way. But basically the what I do to do that is I am proactive in my search for artists that I feel like we could do something cool with. Yeah, I could, and oftentimes it's like I really like the artist, and I also feel like I'm the right person.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, you're gonna like what we do because like I feel like it's a good fit. Not like I want a piece of that because I think it's already great. Oftentimes, if someone is like, people reach out to me sometimes, and it's funny. Like if I really like what they've already done, very often I'm a little bit hesitant to just like jump in because I'm always like, okay, so how did you do this record? It's pretty good. And why do you want to work with me? And sometimes it's like, oh, well, that producer like, died or whatever. And other times they're like, well, yeah, it is good, but it's not my thing. And I think what you do is more my thing. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But if they're like, I thought it sucked, and I'm like, it's pretty good, then it's a little weird because I'm just like, well, I thought that was good. So you're coming to me because you're unhappy with this. I don't know, But anyway, so I think like, yeah. So it's like, yeah, that's my proactive step. Just looking for people that I can help.
That's awesome, man. This has been a lot of fun. Please, before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to work together or whatever.
Yeah, my socials on TikTok and Instagram are Harper James X, which I guess is something that the cool people are doing now. Or maybe they were doing
Maybe
it
you
like a few
started
months
it.
ago, and now they're not. And now I'm out on a limb. Yeah. I feel like Billie Eilish, I don't know. I was like, no, Harper James is taken. So Harper James X on Instagram and TikTok, and harperjamesmusic.com.
Amazing.
My website.
Awesome. Dude, I would
Thank you.
I will have to do a part 2 because I really enjoyed this. If you're ever in LA, definitely text me. We'll get together.
100%.
Yeah.
I used to make more trips there pre-pandemic, and then I kind of just like hunkered down and became like an agoraphobe.
I mean, hey, you're talking to somebody that doesn't really leave their backyard now that the studio's in the backyard. So
I know. I take my 30-minute commute from apartment to studio, and that's my entire life. So
that's awesome. Well, thank you for your time, man. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. That's it for this week's episode of Progressions. Thank you so much for watching or listening. Be sure to check out all the links and resources mentioned in the episode down below in the video description or in your podcast show notes. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, please leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps the show so much. And if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to drop any thoughts or questions about the episode down below. Let's keep the conversation going. For those of you watching, you'll be getting a link to another episode you might enjoy popping up somewhere right about now. And for those of you listening, check out the YouTube. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I will see y'all next time.